you for inviting me to present today. This work is really part of a sort of wider set of work that, based on what Carmela said, when we think quite a lot about what we do when we do environmental valuation. So we tend to be as interested in the methodologies underpinning the work as much as the numbers that kind of pop out of our surveys at the start. So this is very much not quite back to basics, but back to some of the fundamentals of valuation. We're interested in trying to get social or citizen type preferences that have some individual underpinnings, because ultimately the values from environmental valuations, stated preference studies, go into cost benefit analysis. So when we start to think about social or citizens values, for them to be any use in cost benefit analysis, they have to have some individual basis. So that's the kind of wider area, and this paper is just kind of one aspect of it. So it's focusing in on the impact of taxation on public goods values. So let's just see how this works. I'll just thank my co-authors here, Morgan Beeson, Michael Jones-Lee, Hugh Metcalf and Nielsen. So Morgan's our new kid on the block. He's a PhD student that's been associated with this work from the beginning. Some of the work's in his thesis, other parts of it aren't. So we have to thank him for cranking the maths, and then I did find some mistakes, so that was my contribution to the maths. I'm primarily an empiricist who does surveys and experiments. Mike's the sort of founder of the theory underpinning some of this, along with Bergström. So we have a range of expertise in the team. Okay, so the motivation for this paper is the old kind of payment vehicle bias. Some people might be more kind of familiar with that kind of idea. But what we're really interested in is, can we elicit unbiased, truthful or optimum willingness to pay in surveys that respect consumer sovereignty? So what we mean by that is that they allow all preferences to be in there. So my preference is over the public good, over other people's income, over the environment, whatever. And that's important because cost-benefit analysis is based on consumer sovereignty. So that's why that's in there, and using a tax payment vehicle. Now, our point of departure in the paper is Bergström and Jones-Lee's models, which showed that the optimum level of provision of safety expenditure is equivalent for pure altruists and self-interested societies. But the big thing is, in their theoretical models, they assumed first best taxation. And first best taxation is basically people's tax rates are their willingness to pay. So if I if I have a low willingness to pay, my tax rate is low, and if Carmelo has a high willingness to pay, his tax rate is high. So our tax is basically our willingness to pay, and that's first best taxation. What we do theoretically in this paper, we relax that first best taxation assumption and look at what happens if the tax rate is not set at willingness to pay, and it's something else. So we might think of uniform taxes or progressive taxes or that kind of thing. Now, we do find that in a normal situation, when people know their position in society, so they know whether they're rich or poor, they know their value for the public good, they know other people's values for a public good, we find that theoretically, once we relax this assumption, that willingness to pay moves away from the optimal willingness to pay, and it can be in either direction. So that means that under non-first best taxes, the good may be over-provided if willingness to pay was overstated relative to the first best amount, or under-provided if it's understated. There's a kind of distortionary effect of tax on willingness to pay. So that's what we mean by distortionary taxes in this particular context. Now, we have a mechanism, veil of ignorance, which I'll say more about later, that actually removes this distortion in theory. So it gets us back to as if a person is, the values that would be elicited under a first best taxation system, which would equate with optimal provision of the public good. So as well as showing this theoretically, we of course want to test this empirically. Now, we can't go straight out into a stated preference survey because there's too much noise. We wouldn't be able to really drill down on what is the effect of imposing a veil of ignorance on willingness to pay. We could put it in a survey, but there's lots of influences on willingness to pay, so we wouldn't be able to actually narrow it down. So we instead use a laboratory economics experiment to look at this effect. It's important because it just, what we're homing in on is the effect of the elicitation mechanism on willingness to pay. So we want to see whether it differs in front and behind a veil in accordance with our theory. And we actually do find that empirically as well, that this mechanism, which I'll talk more about later, does seem to get rid of the distortion, which means, if we jump back out into our stated preference survey world for a moment, that we could, at least in theory, use any tax-based payment vehicle, put people behind a veil of ignorance in the sense they don't know where they are in terms of the distribution within society, and we could approximate optimal willingness to pay again. So it's another way of saying that we could reduce the bias associated with tax vehicles in stated preference surveys, at least with respect to other regarding preferences and tax vehicles. So there could be other biases in there, but we're looking at a world of altruism, other regarding preferences, and the bias is introduced by non-first best taxes in a stated preference study. So at the moment we've tested it, we've developed the theory, tested it empirically in a lab experiment, and any ideas are welcome how to get it into a stated preference survey. We have to think about that later. But this would mean that we can have citizen-based values that do take account of other regarding preferences, but are also individual-based, which is this idea of respect and consumer sovereignty.
So what do you mean by a veil of ignorance?
I'm going to tell you exactly, it does come later. So what I want to do is develop the theory. Our point of departure is the Bergstrom and Jones-Lees framework of first best taxation, when people know who they are in society. So I know that I'm person one and you're person two, for example. Behind a veil, all I would know would be the endowments related to those positions, but I wouldn't know which position I was in. So that's a veil of ignorance. But I'll come to it in more detail later. So basically how this, it was a very long paper. We have been working at shortening it. So today I want to go through the theory, look at what happens to willingness to pay in front and behind a veil of ignorance under different taxation systems, so first best and just distortionary tax, and then go through our empirical experiment. And in terms of, we look at a first best taxation system and then a uniform taxation system and then some different endowment taxation, so income tax, a proportional and progressive tax system. So they'd be the type of tax systems we might encounter in reality. We don't set taxes at people's willingness to pay. These are the ones that we see in the real world. So that's what we're looking at in the empirical experiment, and then move on to a discussion. So in terms of the theory, okay, so we're basically, we are going to assume a society of two individuals. This is for just analytical tractability. It does generalise to N, but the maths get really messy. So Bergstrom, Jones-Lee and ourselves work in the two-person world because it just is a little bit tidier. But here we're thinking of a pure altruist and their utility function when they've, in a society that has the opportunity to fund a public good from their own private endowments. So in this case, the pro-altruist utility is a function of their own income, some concerns, altruistic concerns to the other person's income, and then over the public good. And this is a public good that comes at a cost both to themselves and to the other individual. So when Z's naught, this is when the public good's not provided. If you set Z to 1, this is when the public good is provided. And we can then generate willingness to pay in those two situations. And this is basically without the public good. So I have some preferences over my income and the other person's income, and this is with the public good. I have some interest over my income and the other person's, and my private benefits from the public good, and the cost both to myself and the other person. Now, if you rearrange that, that means that in a two-person world, individuals' I's willingness to pay, here represented by C, is a function of the private benefits I gets from the public good, the benefits they get from knowing that individual J gets the public good, minus the costs of provision to the other individual. What that means is that my willingness to pay, I care about my consumption of the public good, the other person's consumption of the public good, but recognise that the other person has to pay. And then likewise, J does the same calculation, taking into account the costs to I as well as the benefits. And under this world, doesn't matter doesn't matter what the weights on alpha, my preferences, alpha I's preferences. So individual I preferences over J, alpha. It's actually a bad angle, this. So whatever the strength of preferences for I over J or J over I, basically they cancel out. And we're left that each person's willingness to pay simply reflects their own private value. That's what it avoids the problem that Bergstrom identified. That if I and J don't take account of each other and know that the other person's taken account of them, there'll be double counting. If individual I works out their willingness to pay, taking into account J, and J works out their willingness to pay, taking into account the cost of I, that avoids double counting. And basically, willingness to pay simplifies down to the value to their own private benefit. And that would be under a first best assumption of taxation if we replace CJ, willingness to pay, with CI and CJ with TI and TJ. Under first best taxation, that would then the tax rate would be.
Excuse me, Susan. Does this have anything to do with the Lincoln equilibrium?
The
Lincoln taxation.
Oh, yes. So it's just that the private. It's in the first world. It's the tax rate simplifies to private value. So yes, because we're providing a public good.
It's the ultimate provision of the public good.
Yes. So if we set the tax rate at CI, then it would be equal to XI, the willingness to pay. So we'd get the optimal level of provision. Now, the issue with distortionary taxation is, I'm finding this difficult to see at this angle, actually. The two individuals are instead taxed at TI and TJ. So this is the same as before now, that the pure altruist utility function is a function of their own income, some preferences over the other income, and the public good, where willingness to pay is replaced by their tax share. So if the total cost, C, of the good is equal to aggregate willingness to pay, that in a first best world, TIC equals the willingness to pay. So this is basically the benefits from the good for individual I, taking into account the benefits to themselves and individual J, and then the costs to themselves, their tax share, and the costs to the other individual. So it's basically the good is provided as a sum of TI plus TJ equals 1. And then basically here we get the interaction that I has to think about J when they offer a willingness to pay. So it's this function here that introduces the distortionary effect. I know that if I, as an individual I, increase my willingness to pay, that's also going to increase J's share or cost, regardless of J's preferences. So this is the interaction that brings in the distortion, that now the tax rate becomes or people's willingness to pay becomes a function both of the tax rate and the benefits over the public good. Tax rate matters because if I impose a tax increase on someone else, that reduces their opportunity to consume private goods. So the change in the tax rate captures the effect on people's ability to consume a private good, regardless of the amount of public good that's provided. So it's this interaction in the denominator that will potentially lead to a distortion that's not there in the first best world. Because now, rather than everyone paying their maximum willingness to pay, which is the first best tax share, I now have some kind of predetermined tax share out there in the real world. So now we have a potentially distortionary effect. Now, there are two special cases where this would simplify to the first best result. And that's basically, if I was purely self-interested, I don't weight the other person at all. And then in that case, we have the previous result. But also then as a first best tax share, then basically the tax share is the ratio of the individual's private value to the sum of the private values. So all the, basically alpha has disappeared. The issue is, what happens if preferences are purely altruistic and we're not in a first best world? So we have the way we would look at that is look at an individual's I's response to changes in both their own tax rate and the tax rate for individual J. So the prediction here is if we differentiate equation 8 and look at marginal willingness to pay for I with respect to a change or an increase in their own tax rate, then willingness to pay is predicted to be positive or 0. And that's saying that provided I'm within satiation, I'm willing to pay a bit more for more of the good, which would be reflected in an increase in tax rate. So I will pay more if my share is say we have a tax system of 0.70%. I'm taxed at 70%. Somebody else is taxed at 30%. If I want more of the good, I'm willing to accept a slight increase in taxes to increase the probability of provision of the good because I get some positive utility from it. However, and I'm willing to pay it, I'm willing to take the hit. However, if I consider an increase in tax rate to J because I care about their consumption of private goods as well as public goods, then my marginal willingness to pay with respect to a tax increase for J is negative or 0, below 0. I don't want to impose too much, any extra taxes on J because I care about their income as well as their provision of the public good. So again, what we've got here is some kind of interaction between tax, public good that isn't there under a first best tax system. It also turns out that if I's tax share increases above the first best rate, then that means because they care about J's consumption of the public good, the tax rate will be higher than the private value. So if the private value is £10, they're willing to pay 11 under a tax system so that they can increase J's consumption of the public good. However, what happens here is if we think of the tax distortion is the TI star is the first best tax rate and TI is the tax rate under any particular non-first system. So if someone's private tax rate was higher than their private value, this would be positive, and if someone's tax rate was lower than their private value, this would be negative. So the issue here is that it's the magnitude and sign of this determines whether willingness to pay is distorted, which means willingness to pay could be higher than the optimum level or lower than the optimal level, depending on the particular characteristics of a tax system and whether an individual's willingness to pay happens to be higher than the first base tax or lower. So there's lots of possibilities in terms of that's dependent and that in terms of the way in which willingness to pay is distorted, and it comes down to how the tax system relates, the particular tax system distributes the tax relative to a person's private value. So it's a bit complicated, but basically, so there's a kind of endogeneity in there to some extent. Okay, so what we've done up to now is basically we've kind of assumed alpha's exogenous, but in the real world, and this matters for cost-benefit analysis, alphas might vary across people, so we need a mechanism that allows that to happen, because we could, if pure altruism causes these distortions, one could say that we could use private values. But the problem is that would rule out other regarding preferences that are not purely altruistic. So safety-focused altruism cares about people's distributional, whether people care about whether people are rich and poor. So there's all these other regarding preferences that we would like to remain in people's values if they're going to respect consumer sovereignty. But we want to get rid of the inefficiencies of pure altruism, and the inefficiency is this tax distortion. So that's what we want to get rid of, both in theory and practice. So this is where we introduce the veil of ignorance, and this is based on that. I think most people are aware of the idea of a Rawlsian veil of ignorance, which there's a crucial difference between the version that we've used and the original, and I'll come to that in a moment. But under our veil of ignorance, this is driven from the idea that any ethical decisions should be based on an individual's interests. Both they have to have a stakeholder in society, and what this translates to is that if the public good's provided, I have to pay, so I'm a stakeholder. But I should make that decision from some kind of position of impartiality, so I shouldn't weight my preferences any more than anybody else's. So that drives that's the ethical aspect. And in this case, and under the Harsanyi framework, impartiality is generated through uncertainty over at least some aspects of your position in society. Say more about that in a moment, in terms of how we operationalise that. But it's important because it fits with the Harsanyi framework fits with the with cost-benefit analysis, because it makes the assumption that people's preferences remain unchanged once they're put in this position of impartiality. A Rawls framework, which was really more of a thought experiment, said that once people were unaware of their position in society, they could have a discussion, and they may change their preferences over how they would weight different positions in society after they've discussed it. So the Harsanyi framework doesn't allow for that kind of interaction, which approximates what happens in an evaluation survey and cost-benefit analysis. It's assumed that our preferences are stable in the survey. The only thing that is different is it's behind a veil of ignorance or not. So we want to be capturing the same preferences in our experiment and in a wider survey. So the Harsanyi framework allows us to do that. And what's basically happening here is that now an individual is looking at each position in society and having to work out the utility associated with each position. But because they don't know it, now it's an expected utility. So in a society with two potential positions, a rich and a poor person, I have to weight the utility in each position and then come up with an expected utility. Now, we want to know, so what, does that make any differences to willingness to pay under non-first best taxes? So the crucial difference will be that in front of a veil, an individual maximises their own utility, but behind a veil, they have to consider the utility from each position and then maximise an expected utility from all positions. Now, in our particular scenario in the model, the individual knows they know the distribution of wealth in society, they know the private benefits from the public good, and they know the tax system in place. But they don't know their own wealth, they don't know their own benefit, and they don't know their own tax share. They just know those characteristics for each position. So basically, to maximise utility now, the respondent has to consider themselves in each position. We assume with equal probability because there's no reason to assume otherwise. And basically then for our society of two individuals, for the pure altruist, each position is weighted by their private preferences for the position and the altruistic concern for the other position. If it happened to be equal for both positions, that's as if they're purely self-interest. They're not given any more weight to any other position. So that's effectively they're acting as if they're self-interested. It looks a bit more messy, but what we do here in terms of setting the model up, it's got the same society with two positions, 1 and 2, but now there's two states of the world. So we can imagine the first state would be individual I in position 1, and individual J would be in position 2, or the other option would be that individual I happens to be in position 2, and individual J in position 1. So basically the individual doesn't know which position they're in. We're going to assume that both occur with a probability of half. And what this means as well is, of course, that incomes and private benefits are now tied to positions rather than individuals. We also allow alpha to vary for whatever reasons people want over and above pure altruism. What it now means that each individual, instead of having one coefficient of altruism towards the other person, they've now got 2 coefficients of altruism, which they're basically interested in. So individual I places some weight or has a preference over individuals J welfare when J is in either position 1 or position 2. Now, it makes it all look a bit messy, but what this is basically saying, this is just the same problem as before. So the individual's trying to maximise utility, but now it's in expectation. So this is without the public good provided. So they're interested in endowments across the different positions and take an average. So if I'm in position 1, if I'm thinking about position 1, there's an endowment related to position 2, so I have preferences over that. If I'm in position 2, I have some preferences over the endowment in position 1. That's without the public good. And with the public good provided here, so there's some preferences over what occurs in position 1. So there's an endowment associated with being in position 1, the private benefits of the public good from position 1, provided to a cost to position 1, plus a cost to position 2. And this is basically 1 minus Ti is Tj. So this is basically, and then here it's the same thing. If we're thinking about position 2, there's an endowment, a private benefit associated with position 2, a tax associated with position 2, and then my preferences over position 1. That's all in expectation. It's basically as if a person standing here looking at the 2 positions and taking an average of both of those positions. Now it turns out, of course, that if it's a pure altruist, all the alphas should basically cancel each other out. As I have a preference over that position, I have a preference over that position, I have a preference over that, preference over that. And basically, on average, there's no difference in the weight I put on each position. So the alphas would cancel out. And all that would be, if there are any other regarding preferences, they would still be in to affect this expression here. Now, this expression here is what's called maximum acceptable cost. So this is basically, if we think of willingness to pay I plus willingness to pay J, that's the maximum amount of benefit that society gets from the provision of the goods. So they would be willing to pay up to that. They'd be willing to incur a cost up to the sum of their willingness to pays to fund the good, but no more. So that's kind of like what we think of a maximum acceptable cost. In a first world, best world, we would just saying that instead of summing willingness to pays, we'd sum tax shares. So TI plus TJ is the maximum acceptable tax in aggregate for that society would be willing to pay in order to provide the good and no more. So you can't ask people's individual willingness to pay behind a veil because they don't know their income and they don't know their position in. But if they know about society as a whole, you can actually ask the maximum acceptable cost. And it's similar to, Bergstrom has a kind of hypothetical question that you could ask in a stated preference survey, which would be along the lines of what would be the maximum tax you'd be willing to accept for you and others like you in order to fund a public good. So this is just that idea formalised. So behind a veil, we can't ask willingness to pay, but we can ask what's the maximum acceptable tax or cost they would be willing to accept for the group. Now, what this means is that it again introduces a potential interaction between the cost and the impact on the other person or the other position. I know that if the higher I crank up maximum acceptable cost, I incur not only an increased tax on myself, but also on the other person. Now, if I weight every position equally, all these alphas, everything would cancel out. However, if I do have some other regarding preferences, safety-focused altruism, or distributional concerns, then they would still influence maximum acceptable cost as well. So they're allowed in. So that's what we want. Now, the important thing to say is that we can get back to willingness to pay, because remember, in front of a veil, we can ask people's willingness to pay for something, and we can work out aggregate willingness to pay. But we can also then work out a maximum acceptable cost by multiplying an individual's tax share by by dividing aggregate willingness to pay by their cost. So if we just divide willingness to pay by T star, then we'll get C star, which equates to C star behind a veil. So that's important because we need to be able to test the mechanism empirically. So what we're interested in here is looking at we're behind a veil now. So if we differentiate our maximum acceptable cost function with respect to a tax increase, looks a bit messy, but we've got we've got all the positions weighted in here. Now, the important thing here, if alpha 2 and alpha 1 were equal, then basically all of this other regarding concerns, pure altruism, disappears, and we're left with maximum acceptable cost being the sum of private values. This is behind a veil, which is exactly the same as in front of a veil. Aggregate willingness to pay is the willingness to pay of individual I plus willingness to pay of individual J. And it's pure private values. So if I'm a pure altruist and I care about both consumption of the public good and the endowment in a particular position, then all these nasty alphas disappear and I get this result. However, if they are different, and if this difference is driven by other regarding preferences, then this allows for maximum acceptable costs to be adjusted for other distributional concerns. Well, this is the idea of consumer sovereignty or safety-focused altruism, because we don't want to screen those out. We just want to get rid of the pure altruistic components. And basically, as alpha 1 approaches alpha 2, this tax effect diminishes. So basically, this approaches naught, and once this approaches 0, all of this goes. So what we're saying here, really, the intuition here is that behind a veil of ignorance, changes in taxes shouldn't affect my value, whereas in front of a veil, they did. Remember that individual I, marginal willingness to pay, increased with respect to their own tax share, but decreased with respect to the tax share, an increase in the tax share of J. So there was a change in responsiveness to tax rates in front of a veil, whereas this equation predicts that behind a veil, if the veil's working, we should see no responsiveness to distortionary taxes. People should act as if they're in a first best world, and the distortionary effect of a tax system disappears behind a veil. Now, this means we have, out of all of this theory, we have two quite simple testable hypotheses. We're looking at how willingness to pay responds to a change in tax shares. So if our model predicts that I's willingness to pay is responsive to a change in I's tax. So my willingness to pay, I should increase when my tax share increases, to increase the chance of provision of a good. So we would be looking empirically to reject the null, that willingness to pay is not responsive to the tax share, or in fact is negative. So we're looking to reject that in front of a veil. We're expecting, because of the interaction between tax and provision of the public good and concerns over the other person's private consumption, we're expecting willingness to pay to be responsive to a change in your own tax share. In front, once we go behind a veil, as I said, we're expecting an individual not to be responsive to a change in tax share, because they don't know who they are. They just see changes in tax shares. So it's a bit messy, but there's some strong predictions. So we're expecting to not be able to reject this if the veil works. So as I said, we set up a laboratory experiment, or a standard economic experiment, to test this. And we based, some of you may be aware of a paper by Messer et al., where they basically introduced the random price voting mechanism, which can be shown to deliver efficient provision of a public good, in that an individual's weakly dominant strategy is to offer their maximum willingness to pay. And then they basically have a threshold willingness to pay value, and anyone that offers a higher willingness to pay is assumed to have voted yes to a proposition to provide public good. And if their willingness to pay is lower than the threshold, they're assumed to vote no. So what we do, we take that as our basic mechanism, but they had, well, we extend it to have asymmetric costs of provision in the model. We put a veil of ignorance on it, so people don't know who they are when they're offering a willingness to pay. And what's the other thing? So it's there's a third thing that we've adopted it for, but basically I can't remember the third thing, but with asymmetric costs and behind a veil. So just briefly, so we're again playing groups of two, because it's all we need to provide our exploration of the mechanism. So we're abstracting from reality. As I said, in theory, the model generalizes to n persons, but we kept it simple. So we can prove our point with a two-person game. It just reduces the noise. So we have a position S and a position L. So S is with a small endowment, and L is with a large endowment, so a poor person and a rich person. they're able to fund a public good with a non-negative payoffs. So we're not playing in the world of losses, it's a world of gains. The veil introduces risk preferences, so there's no need to no need to put risks in the model, because it would just add extra noise, and we want to see in a clean world what happens with the mechanism. So if we have certain payoffs, that gets rid of that potential confounds. Now each group has to enter their MAC value, so this maximum acceptable cost. So they're in a group of 2, and they have to offer a maximum acceptable cost value. Thinking of it as the maximum threshold, they'd accept the group as a whole to pay. And then we randomly draw a cost of the public good, and anyways, that's group members with a MAC greater or equal to the cost. We assume they vote yes and others no. Now, yes, that's not really, none of that's important. So what we're going to do, just to summarise, we elicit MAC for each subject, for each position, and in front of behind a veil, and in 4 public good settings. I'll come to the treatments in a moment, but basically people switch positions. Sometimes they're rich, sometimes they're poor, sometimes they're playing in a first best tax system world, sometimes they're playing in a uniform tax world, and so on. But we have, within each tax system, within each setting, I'll come to these in a minute. So we have 4 different settings, which are to do with endowments and returns, and different types of public goods. So if somebody was in treatment 1, they're always with a particular tax system, and they might make 5 decisions under this setting, change treatment, and by changing treatment they would change tax system, and then we'd show them different decisions within the tax system. But just to go through these tax systems, the first tax, we set the tax rate as in equation 9, so that's simply the ratio between their own return and the group return, so that's the first best. The uniform, we set the tax rate at 0.5, so everyone pays a tax of 50%, and then these are our 2 income type taxes, endowment taxes. We have a proportional tax, where it's the ratio of the person, so this is the person S, the poor person, it's the ratio of their endowment to the income of the group as a whole, and then the progressive endowments, it just squares those terms. So we'd expect this one to be the most responsive to any distortion. So they're the 4 tax systems. So we have 4 different settings, and this setting is basically with a particular endowment. So here we have a poor person endowed with 100 tokens, which were convertible to cash, and a rich person 150. This was the return from the public good. So if the public good gets provided, the poor person gets an extra 40 pence or pounds or dollars, and the rich person gets a return of 60. So we can see that in this case, if you're rich, you start with more and get a better return from the public good. So you're going to have quite a high interest in providing the public good. And then, given these endowments and returns, we have different types of tax system. And then the next setting is we keep the endowment the same and change the return. And again, we have different tax rates across the different systems. The thing to note here is that within the different non-first best taxes, the tax rate stays the same, regardless of the treatment. But for the first best, it changes, and it's the difference between these that will cause the different types of distortions across. So if you think of Ti minus Ti star, it's the difference between the first best rate and these different systems that will be driving that. So we pool the data, and we have 816 observations, and these are from position S and position L, in front and behind the veil. Now, in front of the veil, people knew whether they were in position S or position L, so they knew whether they were rich or whether they were poor, and they knew the return they would get if the public good was provided. Behind the veil, they see the same screen or the same decision, except they don't know which position they're in. So that's the only difference there. So in order to test the effect of distortionary taxations, we're going to look at willingness to pay from the two positions, so willingness to pay of poor people and rich people, and then we're going to look at aggregate willingness to pay, but most importantly we're going to look at maximum acceptable cost from behind a veil and compare that with the maximum willingness to pay, which we've been able to get from in front of the veil. So, so basically how people behave in the two position will allow us to test H1, which will be in front of the veil, and then going behind the veil, we'll look at maximum acceptable cost. And remember here that we're looking for non-responsiveness to changes in the tax, so we're expecting any coefficient on MAC to be not significant if the model is working as predicted. Okay, yes, so there's three variables that we care about: willingness to pay in the two position and maximum acceptable cost. Our tax distortion variable, we could have done it from the rich person's perspective, but we've calculated it from the poor person. So a tax distortion is basically the difference between the tax share contributed by that person under that tax regime and the first best tax shares. So this is basically TI star and this is TI. So if there was no distortion, this would be 0. And if there's a distortion, it may be positive or negative, depending on the parameters that are at play and the tax system that's in place. But so basically we have this variable, and this will be the variable that we'll look at to test whether the veil works or not. So we've got 4 regressions, simple regressions, and what we're interested in here will be these coefficients, beta 3, on the tax distortion. So just to, we're going to go back to equation 18 in a moment, but we're basically looking to see whether beta 3 is positive, well, whether it's positive or negative, it doesn't matter, it will depend on the particular, whether people are in a rich or poor position, but importantly, we really want to be able to not reject beta equals 3. But in terms of willingness to pay small in front of a veil, then what we're looking for is to reject the null and see respondents responding to tax distortion as predicted. So we're expecting a higher willingness to pay from somebody who's relatively poor, and if their current tax share is less than their private value, we're expecting their willingness to pay to increase, or stated willingness to pay or stated willingness to accept a tax increase to increase, because they know they're only paying a small share of the tax, and by agreeing to pay a tax they also know that the rich person will have to pay more in tax, and this basically increases the probability of provision. So we're expecting a positive and significant coefficient in front of the veil for a poor person. For the well-endowed or the richer person, because they're taking into account the increased cost to the poor person, we're expecting this to be negative and significant. Aggregate willingness to pay, that will depend on the relative strengths of altruism and other regarding preferences, so this could be positive or negative, depends on how strong these impacts are. And then we're also, in terms of behind the veil, 21, we're looking for this to be insignificant. So once people don't know where they are in society, the tax system actually doesn't matter. They're operating as if it's a first best tax system, for want of a better analogy. So, empirically, let's get to the results, we can basically see that in front of the veil, we'll come to this, to the tax distortion effect in a moment, but this just checks here that with respect to the benefits from the public good, in front of the veil, whether I'm poor or rich, I offer a higher willingness to pay. So that's as expected, and we would expect to see that. Here, this is the row that matters, that our hypothesis bearing out, because here we see that for the poor person, there's a positive and significant effect of the tax distortion on willingness to pay, and that means they're willing to accept a higher tax because they know that the other person who's actually paying a higher tax share will also have to pay that. So that's a distortionary effect in the way that's expected for a pure altruist, of course. And also for the richer person, it's negative here and significant because they are taking into account the fact that if they offer to a higher maximum acceptable cost, or if they're willing to incur a higher tax rate, they also know that they'll incur that the poor person will have to incur that tax increase as well. So that's the negative and significant effect there. Because of the parameters of our particular experiment, this is a stronger effect. That's not really a problem, or it's not an issue. If we use different parameters and different endowments, the relative effect might well change. The main thing is that we would, in front of a veil, we expect it to be significantly different from zero, either positively or negatively, indeed it is. The important thing here is behind the veil, the effect of tax distortion has disappeared. I more or less said that. The only thing to maybe draw attention to here is that it does look that, as might be expected, that richer subjects can afford to be more altruistic than poorer subjects in front of the veil. And in general, distortionary taxes that favour redistribution towards position S actually means that willingness to pay, we could lead to an over-provision of a public good, because the poorer person knows if they accept a small tax increase, the richer person also has to, and if their richer person's paying a higher share, that's going to lead to an overall increase in the provision of a public good. So there is a potential with some of these redistributive taxes, particularly the progressive one, that they are definitely going to elicit suboptimum willingness to pays and over or under provision of a public good in front of a veil. Behind the veil, it just appears that distortionary taxes are not, valuations aren't significantly affected by distortionary taxes. Because we know that in front of the veil they are. People are behaving altruistically. Away behind the veil, the inefficient effect of altruism is negated. This does not mean that people aren't allowed to be altruistic behind the veil. It just means the effect of that altruism, which would be the over or under provision of a public good, doesn't occur anymore. And it's basically as if the tax system was first best. So the effects of altruism are dissipated because of this. There's basically taken an average over all the different positions. The altruism all cancels out in the aggregation. It's still in there when they elicit when they calculate their expected utilities, but the veil of ignorance seems to get rid of that inefficient with respect to levels of provision of the public good. And that's more or less saying the same thing. So just in terms, there's quite a lot of the paper. We start by basically replicating Bergstrom and Jones-Lee's findings, that's the point of departure. But then we relax the assumption of first best taxation. We find in front of a veil that pure altruist willingness to pay does increase as the cost share increases, and that's whether somebody's rich or poor, because they know that the other person is going to fund the good. However, what this means is that the potential distortionary effect could happen because of this interaction between tax and pure altruism. But whether it's positive or negative depends on the particular endowments within society. But it does seem that the veil of ignorance removes the effect of the tax distortion, and it leaves other distributional concerns intact. And I guess that I didn't go into it, but there was positive, the constant was positive in the regressions, so that might imply other stuff's in there. We're not worried about that. That does not lead to inefficiencies in provision, because if you follow the Jones-Lee kind of idea that preferences towards the environment or safety-focused altruism, so if I care about Carmelo's safety irrespective of the effect on his income, then that is permissible in values, so it allows those kind of things to be in. And it's also hypothesized that we can't measure how much, we can't measure the different types of altruism with an individual. So I might be purely altruistic, I might have a bit of safety-focused altruism in my values, I might have different things. It's unlikely that I don't care at all about somebody's income. So we can never work out the effect that those other regarding preferences are having, but it's hypothesized that pure altruism is, well, it's not hypothesized, it's the fact that pure altruism is the type of altruism that causes inefficiencies in public good provision. Okay, so in terms of right back to where we started, because we actually do stated preference studies, is that I know that Carmela and Jorge, you've done an empirical study, haven't you? It's not mentioned there, but it is in the paper. That when we've tried to look at non-first best taxations in an empirical setting, the stated preference literature tells us that these public valuations tend to exceed private valuations. So it looks like there's a potential inefficiency is creeping in there, leading to potential over-provision of the public good. If we use the values of stated preference studies and cost-benefit analysis. So in terms of risk reductions, public willingness to pay was higher than private willingness to pay. Jones-Lee found this, and I know that you and Jorge did. Here we see that uniform taxation against first best taxation. So it seems that there is some kind of distortionary effect going on when we in stated preference studies. Now, this paper would sort of seem to suggest that if we were able to employ a veil of ignorance in a stated preference study by somehow making people unaware of what they were in a particular society, then it might get rid of that distortion. And it's a sort of, as I was saying, there's payment vehicle bias. Not all payment vehicle bias is due to the particular taxation system, but some will be, because different payment vehicles may well imply equal tax shares or proportional tax shares or progressive tax shares. They will have some potential or may have some potential distributional impacts associated with them. So a veil of ignorance could kind of what it would do, it would allow altruistic preferences in the values, but it would remove the distortion from the tax system with respect to the willingness to pay values that the survey generated. So that's really, it's hard to know what goes on in stated preference studies and in terms of how you would make someone unaware of where they are in the distribution of society. Certainly people have some idea of where they are with respect to their income and endowments in a society, but don't forget we also have to think about how the benefits of the public good are distributed within society, and certainly I'd have much less certainty about that, where relatively speaking, you know, did I value it much more highly relative to Carmelo or much lower? I may, you know, an N is large, probably don't know so much about that. So we have got some uncertainty in there. They may take them into account, we don't know. But it's certainly, we do think that beliefs about others' valuations may impact on altruistic individuals. So if I also care, though, about not only the benefits from the public good, but if I care about people's incomes, all of these are going to be going on in a stated preference study, and it becomes difficult to disentangle, but it is definitely the case that if I do care about people's incomes and their preferences over taxes and costs, then I might over or understate my willingness to incur a tax, depending on how my tax share and how I view Carmelo's welfare and whether I know he's rich or poor. So all these things are going to be going on in there in a stated preference survey that we're at the moment not controlling for. And if we could impose a veil of ignorance, actually we don't need to control for any of these things anymore, because people are they're only looking at different positions and different within society instead of different people. And that would make if our theoretical model and experiment to be believed, this should increase the chances that the willingness to pay values were efficient as opposed to inefficient. But how we would go about doing that, and also how you would go about operationalising a maximum acceptable cost in a field survey is quite another matter. But the important point is that empirically and theoretically the mechanism works. So at least it would at least be a hypothetical possibility to ask for MAC and impose a veil of ignorance. But how we would do that is another matter, because you'd be basically asking for somebody to say how much taxes in aggregate should society spend on reducing air pollution. That's not an easy question to answer, and even harder than maybe willingness to pay. But what we're trying to do with this veil of ignorance is get rid of problems like double counting. It's not dealt with here, but and distortions that arise out of the way a good's funded. I mean, distortions can arise, inefficient willingness to pay could arise people's time preferences and time, things like that. There's lots of reasons why willingness to pay may be suboptimal from stated preference surveys, and this is just one way of them. This could, in theory, get rid of that distortion, but in practice, I think that's for another day, unless anyone has any ideas.